Alrighty folks, today we have some instances of gruesome killings, people eating, and more to tickle your fancy, all with a Victorian timestamp. I'm excited, you're excited, let's get into it. John Owen brutally killed the entire Marshall family in Middlesex in 1870. Now he had been employed by the head of the family, Emmanuel, who refused to pay him for what he deemed poor work. So what did Owen do? Well, on the night of May 22nd, he snuck into the home and sent each member to death with a sledgehammer. He then changed into one of Emmanuel's best suits, looted the family's property, and got the heck out of there. The next day, he pawned the stolen items and continued to wear the nice suit while spending money like a fool. A couple of days afterwards, the Marshall family seamstress got to the house, was like, hey, where is everybody? Peered through one of the windows, and when she saw what had transpired, she called the police, who initially thought Emmanuel was responsible, but then they later found his body and realized, okay, we've got a killer on the loose. Great. So at the time of the deaths, Owen lived in a lodging house alongside a man known only as Coombs. And following the news that 6 bodies had been found at the Marshall family cottage, Buddy was like, Owen, he's normally very poor, barely able to scrape together enough money to pay for anything, and all of a sudden he's flashing all this cash, he's wearing a nice suit, which, by the way, that suit matches the description a neighbor had given to the police of a man she saw leaving the property. Yeah, 224. Owen was eventually caught, convicted, and went the way of the rope necklace on August 8th of 1870. Mary Ann Cotton was one of the most prolific serial killers that you've probably never heard of. She was born in Sunderland on Halloween of 1832, and when she was 20, she married William Mowbray, and they eventually moved up north where William undertook work as a fireman. He died in 1865 of an intestinal disorder, and she collected his insurance payout. After his death, she moved to Durham and began working at the Sunderland Infirmary, where she met George, who was a patient. They got married in August of 1865, but George died in 1866 of intestinal problems, put down to typhoid. And what did Mary do? She collected a sum of money following her late husband's death. She got married many times over the years, always spawning another offspring, but then the offspring and the husband would die from intestinal problems, and she'd find a new hubby, move, spawn again. She wasn't suspecting of killing anybody until she was approached by a parish official named Thomas Riley, and he asked her, hey, can you take care of this woman with smallpox? And she's like, I can't. This son, he's a bit of a hindrance, but like if I could send him off to a workhouse. Now, they were like, no, if he goes, you have to go. And she's like, oh, it won't be that big of a deal. He'll go like all the rest of them. So 5 days later, when she reported her son as dead, Thomas was like, can we investigate this woman? Because it turns out she took out a life insurance policy for her son. But the jury returned a verdict of natural causes. Well, after that investigation, local media looked into her past, realized she had left 11 descendants, 3 husbands, 2 lovers, and her mother 2 gastric diseases. Mary was arrested and sent to trial, where she was found guilty of killing and sentenced to the rope necklace. Only 2 of her descendants survived, by the way. A serial killer who was known as the Derby Poisoner was Lydia Sherman. She lived in the eastern United States between 1824 to 78. She seemingly had no regard for human life, and not even her own descendants. She reportedly killed 3 husbands with arsenic in a span of 7 years, and disposed of 8 offspring the same way, 6 of them being her own. All of these deaths were officially attributed to typhoid fever at the time, with no one being any the wiser to her secret life as a serial killer. Now, her crimes did catch up to her, and she was sentenced to life in prison, but jeepers. Typhoid, eh? H. Holmes, and yes, the temptation to call him Triple H is not lost on me, was an American swindler and confidence trickster who was widely considered the country's first known serial killer. He was born into a wealthy family and showed signs of high intelligence from an early age. Always interested in medicine, he allegedly trapped animals and performed surgery on them. Some accounts of his life even suggest that he killed a playmate when he was younger. In 1886, he moved to Chicago and took a job as a pharmacist, and soon afterwards began killing people in order to steal their property. The house he built for himself was equipped with secret passages, trap doors, soundproof rooms, gas jets to asphyxiate victims, and a kiln to cremate the bodies. At the peak of his career during the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, he allegedly seduced and killed a number of women, typically by becoming engaged to them and then killing them after securing control of their life savings. He also required his employees to carry life insurance policies, naming him as a beneficiary so that he could collect the money after he killed them. What did he do with the bodies? He sold them to local medical schools, making even more cash. He was eventually arrested for one of his killings and confessed to 27 crimes, and also later increased the total to more than 130, though some researchers have suggested that the real number exceeded 200. The Servant Girl Annihilator, also known as the Austin Axe Killer and the Midnight Assassin, was an unidentified American serial killer who preyed upon the city of Austin, Texas in 1884 and 85. According to Texas Monthly, the victims were 7 women, 5 black, 2 white, and 1 black man. Additionally, the serial killer seriously injured 6 women and 2 more men. How did this happen? Well, all the victims were attacked indoors while they slept in their beds. 5 of the women were dragged unconscious but still alive and killed outdoors, and 3 of the women were severely mutilated. All the victims were posed in a similar manner, and 6 of them had a sharp object inserted into their ears. Now, the killings represent an early example of a serial killer operating in the US, and this was like 3 years before Jack the Ripper started doing his thing. Fanny Adams was an English girl who was killed by a solicitor's clerk, Frederick Baker, in Alton, Hampshire in 1867. Her death was extraordinarily brutal and caused a national outcry in the UK. So Baker abducted Adams and took her into a hop garden near her home, where he killed and dismembered her. Some parts of her body were never found. Now, investigations suggested that 2 small kitchen utensils were used for the crime. It was later ruled that wouldn't have worked. But what did he use? We'll never know. Nowadays, we know of criminal organizations that sell human organs for transplant, but way back in the Victorian era, there was a more gruesome equivalent. In 1879, Kate Webster was fired from her post as servant to a Mrs. Thomas, and in revenge, she killed her mistress with an axe to the skull, sliced her body to pieces, and boiled it up in a large pot. She then burned the bones and the meat, but she kept the body fat. What'd she do with it? She sold it as beef dripping, which was a popular food at the time. You used it for a lot of things. Yeah, we don't know what happened to her after that, but like, ugh. No thank you, no thank you. Make sure you know where your food's coming from, folks. On the morning of September 5th of 1873, a policeman rowing down the River Thames made a grisly discovery. In some mud, he saw some human remains. Or to be more precise, he found the left quarter of a woman's torso. What's more, just a couple hundred meters away, somebody else, another officer, found the right side of the woman's torso. The next day, we got a face, a scalp, but not attached to a full head, followed by a thigh, a part of an arm, and also a shoulder. Dr. Kempster, the police surgeon at the time, had an ingenious, albeit horrific, way of trying to solve the mystery. He made a mechanical frame on which he placed the body parts, including the head. And then what'd he do? Well, he invited members of the public to see if they could identify the victim. Yeah, there was a lot of people that were like, ooh, let's try. Nobody could provide a name. But Dr. Kempster did conclude that the body had been cut up by somebody who knew how to wield a scalpel. 5 years later, the dismembered remains of a second woman were found in various locations across central London. 1889, a third body turned up in pieces. Like, for more than 2 weeks, body parts were just popping up everywhere. After a 4th cut-up body was found in September of 1899, some folks thought that Jack the Ripper and this now torso killer were one and the same person. However, given the different methods used, the police and the press were like, no, we've just got 2 killers. In more recent years, historians have claimed that the killer might have been active in Paris as well, as cut-up bodies were turning up in the French capital around the same time. But to this day, nobody's been conclusively identified as the torso killer. Back in his day, Richard Dabb was one of Britain's most famous artists. He even believed himself to be guided by the ancient Egyptian god Osiris. His worried family insisted he spend some time in the Kent countryside to recover upon his return to England. On the evening of August 28th of 1843, Dad was strolling through a park with his father. All of a sudden, he attacked. He slashed his own father's throat and then impaled him in the chest repeatedly. And still in a daze, he fled to Dover and caught a ferry to France. And even though he did make it to Paris, well, he then attacked a coach passenger. This man thankfully survived, and Dad was overpowered and apprehended. He was soon sent back to England, where he'd already been labeled a madman, and judged to be criminally insane. The authorities agreed with the popular verdict, especially after Dad told them that the god, Osiris, had told him that his father was in fact the devil in disguise and needed to be killed. He was first sent to the Bedlam Asylum and then to another hospital. He continued painting though, and he received visitors right up until his death in 1886. Out of all the Victorian killers, Amelia Dyer is one of the most prolific, but I don't think she's widely spoken about. Okay, help me out here, folks. You know what Cabbage Patch dolls look like, right? Okay, so that's gonna sub in for Descendants in today's story, partially so my amazing editor has something to put on the screen so we don't get in trouble. She resided in Reading and after being widowed, took to cabbage patch farming to sustain an income. What did that involve? Taking in unwanted and illegitimate people for a fee. And by people, I mean Cabbage Patch dolls. Most farmers would neglect the unwanted to the point that they died, at which point they would restart the process and receive a fee for a new one. And initially this is what Amelia did. But in a bid to maximize her profits, she resorted to faster killings in the forms of hands around the neck. After some time, a physician became kind of suspicious of the number of unwanted that were dying under Amelia's care and involved the authorities. She was convicted of neglect, sentenced to a little 6 months of hard labor. When she left prison, she returned to farming, but moved from area to area and assumed various identities so that the authorities wouldn't be able to track her. She also stopped seeing physicians and resorted to putting bodies in the river. Now, at one point, a body washed up on the shore of the river with white tape wrapped around the neck. The police were able to trace it back to Amelia and raided her house. And over time, several more bodies with white tape around the necks were found. At her trial at the Old Bailey in March of 1896, Amelia claimed insanity, but she was convicted of killing, albeit just one account. Given the 30-year period that she was a farmer, it's estimated that she killed between 300 to 400 humans. And that's it for me once again, folks. I've been Alexa, the resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.